So Adobe has just released their October 2023 release, and in that they have made some updates to Lightroom Classic that I am very excited about. Now, these changes are probably in the mobile web version of Lightroom as well, but I do not use that version at all, so I don't know if it's updated or not, so don't quote me on that. But in Lightroom Classic, the desktop version, they have added something that I have been wanting for a long time. Now, it looks different than I thought it would be, but functionally it is exactly the same. So without further ado, let's jump right in. Now, if we go to the color mixer, the new thing that they've added is point color. Now, the thing about the mixer is a very powerful panel. I use it all the time. I rarely would use saturation or vibrance. I'm always going to make those adjustments in the color that I want. So I use the panel all the time. But the problem was the panel was always at a global level. You could not adjust the individual colors at a local level using an adjustment brush of some sort, or a linear gradient or radial gradient. And I've always wanted that because there are times where I want to impact a color, but I don't want it to impact that color globally across the entire image. So I've been wanting this for a very long time. So they've added in what is called point color. And essentially what it is you have an eyedropper, and it just allows you to pick whatever color you want to pick, and then you can make the adjustment to that color. Now, I've done a lot of testing on this, and for a majority of the time, I didn't see a big difference in terms of the refinement versus the mixer and the point color. So where I'm making this adjustment, where I'm picking the dress, if I was to pick the yellow hue or the orange hue in the mixer panel, I was seeing very similar results. Now, there was some images where there was very vibrant colors. There definitely was more refinement in using point color. Absolutely. So depending upon the color that you're picking, the vibrancy of it, and the other colors that you have in the image, you definitely may see a better use in the point color because it's just more refined. You're picking a specific color versus kind of just a global red or magenta or yellow. But in general, it's about the same. But where this has the power for me is that it can be done at a local level. Now, you'll notice right now, if I make this change here, you can see up top here that it's also affecting these lights that were up here as well, right? So if I move this along, you can see as the dress changes, so do those lights at the top. And that was always the problem with this panel at a global level that forced me to have to go into Photoshop sometimes, because there were times where I wanted to impact something like, you know, what the subject was wearing, but then it's impacting everything else, especially if you're doing yellow, right? If you impact your yellow, that's going to impact all of your greens. It can have an impact on your blue. So you don't always want that done at a global level. It forced you to have to go into Photoshop, where now we can go into, say, select subject. I can even go further and have it select the outfit, but for the sake of the video, we'll keep it at select subject. Now I can come in here, do the eyedropper. And now when I make that change, you'll notice that the dress has changed, but the lights up top here have not. So now I have that control to be able to adjust the color specifically within any area. And so you can have, let's delete this mask here. So now you can take an adjustment or a brush here and just kind of brush in where you want. And now you come in here, you do this here, and we can adjust just that area. Now, of course, that looks terrible, but I'm just trying to illustrate now the control that you can have over adjusting the hue or the saturation or the luminance of a specific color at a local level. That is huge for me, because when it comes to color, I want as much refinement as I can possibly have. I want to get that as specific as I possibly can. I don't really want to do these global changes. For the most part, most of my editing is more localized because different parts of your image need to be edited differently. So now that I have the ability to adjust the color at a local level, I'm very excited. Now, another feature that they've added in is what they call lens blur. Now, it's early access, so basically what that means is is kind of beta. I don't know why they're calling it early access versus beta. It basically is beta because it's not a final product, and they're encouraging you to go to the forum and provide your feedback. That's exactly what beta is. But basically what it is what you have been finding in iPhones and Samsung phones and Google phones, where you can add in the artificial blur after the fact and have control over that blur, which I figured at some point Lightroom was going to jump into, Adobe was going to jump into, because it's such a marketed thing in phones. It was only a matter of time before they added this. Now, personally, I've never been a fan of it because I have never found it to look organic. Granted, I'm a photographer, so I can see and say, yep, that's fake. You know, the way that it's applying it that's just not the way that it would be. So I've never really been a big fan of it, but I do think in some circumstances, it could be useful. So I have an image here. I tried to find one that was pretty busy, and I used a kit lens for this. So I was trying to find something where, you know, I would have a lot of depth. And so basically what it does when you do this and you do apply, it's going to analyze the image, and it's essentially trying to find where the focus should be, and then create essentially a depth map to be able to apply the blur in an organic way. So if I toggle this on and off, first of all, so you kind of can see, and hopefully you can see, so right here, obviously there's some blur here and there's some blur back here. So if I turn that off, you can see that they blurred this and they blurred this. So there's quite a bit of stuff here to where you could have some control. So the first thing I want to talk about is this focal range. Now, essentially what that is that's where you're telling it where in the image the focus should be. So 0 on the left side, on the far left, is going to be closest to the camera, and all the way to 100 is going to be far back. So right now you can see it's set to 41 and 77, and I'm saying that so I remember, so I can put it back. If I move this all the way to the left, you'll notice that all of this is blurred, because what I've essentially told it was that this is where the focus is in the image. So it's going to then try to apply that blur to the rest of the image. Likewise, if I bring it all the way to the right, I'm telling it that this is the focus of the image. So it's going to try to apply that blur all the way here. So it has determined correctly that this is where the focus is. So it's applied some blur here and it's applied some blur here. So if you click on the visualize depth button, what that is showing you is essentially what it's determined to be the closest to the image, and then, or the closest to the camera, and then the furthest from the camera. So your warmer tones are going to be what it's determined to be closest, and then the more purple tones is what is further away. So it utilizes this to be able to have there be a gradual fall off in the blur. And then you have options here, and let me zoom in right here so you can see you have options here to have different types of bokeh, essentially. So, you know, if you kind of like that, and can you see it? I don't know if you can see it in here. Let me go in. Let's go in 200% here. So as I shift through those, you can kind of see how it's applying the different types of bokeh quality. So if you have a specific lens where there's a type of bokeh characteristic that you like, if those options are there, you have those different options. And of course, you can increase and decrease the blur amount to your liking. And then you also have the option down here to manually tell it to have something in focus or to have something blurred. So just because blurring it will be easier to see, if I take this brush and I come down here, as you can see, I've told it to blur that. So if I go up to 100%, now you can see that wherever I'm painting this, it is blurring that as well. So it gives you the ability, if it doesn't get it exactly right, you can go in and really fine tune this. Now, as I said, I'm not a big fan of this because to get this to look natural and organic, I think it can be tricky. Now, I'm a photographer, so I understand the way it's supposed to look. Non-photographers, so your regular clients or the people that are looking at your stuff, they're probably not going to be able to tell. As a matter of fact, that's a given, considering that people love the look that the iPhone and the Samsung and the Google phones produce with this type of effect. People love it. So clearly, for most people, they're not going to care if it's true to how it should be and any of that. So although this isn't something that I would use, I do like that it's in here because it gives you that ability to, kind of adjust that after the fact. Maybe you were using a lens that wasn't as fast as you would like, and you kind of want to add a little bit of blur in post, or there's some other situation. I think if you're going to try to add blur after the fact, having something like this is nice, because instead of just going into, say, Photoshop and doing like a Gaussian blur and masking out the subject, so now you don't have that depth, this gives you the ability to at least have some sort of depth to it, to where it's not just a global blur that's being added that's never going to look organic. So it's cool that they've added it. So a few other things, minor things that they've added. Now you can edit and export in HDR. Now they have this button that they've added up here in the basic panel, and that's how you toggle it on and off. Now the thing is, if you don't have an HDR display, you're not really going to be able to see this. This is designed for HDR displays. And as a matter of fact, if you look up here, and I click this right here, it basically says, there's no HDR display available, so you're not really going to see it. Now, there are some changes. You can kind of see a little bit, especially in the clouds there, that it's doing something. But if you don't have an HDR display, not going to do much. I don't really like HDR stuff. I've never really found it to look organic, even though our eyes really can see things pretty HDR-ish. But I don't know. I've just never been a big HDR fan. I don't have an HDR monitor, so not really something that I would use. But if you're into HDR, great feature there. And then in the history tab over here, which I never used the history tab, so I didn't know that they didn't have this. I honestly would have thought this would have already been there. But now when you go over the history, you see the change happening live. So if I do something over here, let's set that down, and I go over here to history. When I hover over that particular thing, you can see what the image looked like pre that action. So if you use the history, that's really cool. And then over here in the presets, which I don't use presets either, so this isn't something that I ever would have paid attention to or noticed, but you now can search. I would have thought that would have been there already too, but apparently it wasn't, because it was added in. So now there's that. And then there were some performance improvements, which every time they do these performance improvements, nothing ever seems different to me, but I don't pay attention enough to really even know. And it's not worth it for me to try to do like benchmarks and all that sort of stuff. There's some improvements. I'll put them on the screen. If you notice it, great. If not, cool. And then, of course, they added some support for new cameras, and that's that. So that's Lightroom Classic 13.0, just released today. I'm definitely going to be using point color a ton. Favorite feature, hands down. Thank you, Adobe.